10 years ago, I didn't know anything about grief. I was 25 years old and death came knocking at my door. It was bad enough getting a surprise visit from death, but even worse to find out that he was here for my daughter Skylar, who was just 2 months old. My husband and I found out she had a terminal condition called spinal muscular atrophy. We'd be lucky to see her first birthday. I told Death that I would do everything I could to keep him out of our home. But Death knew from experience that it was just a matter of time, and so he waited patiently on our front porch. And every day I would see him, and every day I would look at my daughter's face and know that I didn't know how much time we had left, or how much time any of us had left for that matter. I would sit with my daughter at night as she fell asleep, wondering if tomorrow would be the day that death would come for her. I cursed death almost daily, but I realized that the fear and the worry that I felt watching her and wondering was robbing me of peace and joy. So, eventually, I committed to letting go, letting that fear and worry to stay focused on the present. And eventually, I started to find peace, even with death sitting by my side. Over the next months, death even began to inspire me. His presence reminded me to focus on the present, to make the most of our time together, knowing we might not know how much we have left. My husband and I spent time walking around our neighborhood, enjoying walks, exploring the Georgia Aquarium, snuggling and watching movies. That was my favorite. We even had a friend gift us a professional portrait session to preserve memories. Over the next months, Death and I became closer. We spent more time together. He even came inside to sit with me. There were several days that Skylar would turn blue and I would be able to get her back. Several evenings that my husband and I would sit around the table and talk to Death, knowing that he was going to somehow fit into our future. With the help of other SMA families and an SMA researcher, we were able to have 21 beautiful and challenging months with our baby girl, Skylar, before we had to say goodbye. The time came for death to transition Skylar out of this world. And that day was the hardest day of my life. As I held her in my arms as she took her last breath, the pain in my chest was indescribable. I understood how people could die of a broken heart. I knew that I would survive with each inhale and with each exhale. I found that I was getting through those moments. That grief in that raw moment after losing Skylar was nothing like the grief that I had learned about through the 5 stages. I had heard about the the anger and the bargaining, the depression and the final acceptance of grief, but what I realized was that resonated with me so much more in her diagnosis than in her actual death. And in researching grief and learning more about it, I realized that these stages of grief were actually researched and discovered for people facing their own death. That was really revolutionary for me because that made so much more sense. There are these 5 stages that lead to an endpoint, someone's death. I wondered what else we had gotten wrong about grief. We chose to bury Skylar in a natural cemetery. My husband built her box with so much love and grief. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. Ramsey Creek Preserve let us dig her hole and bury her ourselves. Something that was so painful, but it felt so right. Something that we could do to honor her and take care of her our last act as parents before putting her in the ground. As we really just went to that burial ground and dug, we took the shovels and pierced the ground and used our grief and despair to help us. We were slinging dirt, and eventually it just led to disbelief. How could we be doing this? How are we burying our little girl? It was not an easy thing, but it also was so good and healing. I'll never forget when it was done, we were soaked in snot, sweat, and tears. We were working so hard, and that Georgia red clay is tough, man. And it was just so hard, but it was so good because with each piercing of the ground, we were able to let some of that energy and emotion flow out. And when it was done, we went down to the creek and we washed our hands that were covered in clay. And as the water poured over them, it felt as if there was a cleansing happening. And my hands slowly went from dark red to white. And as I watched the clay drift off in the current, I felt a little piece of my pain go with it. Skylar's memorial service was just a few days later. And it was the first time I was taught anything formally about grief. Our pastor did a phenomenal job honoring Skylar's life, our pain, and our grief. He did such a beautiful job. I hope I can do his words justice here. But he said, sometimes in the rush to fix things, to make things better, we say things that we ought not to say. It is not okay. Let's not hurry this process. I promise you, there is nothing you can do or say to make this better. And he looked at my husband and I and said, Kyle and Ashley, we are not going to try and fix your pain or hurry you, but we're going to sit with you in this, and we're going to ask for God's help, his mercy, and his grace. He went on later to say that one of the most damaging things we can do is to ignore the pain of grief, to pretend like it doesn't hurt as bad as it really does. We're not doing grief justice when we do that. His words were such a relief. When I was growing up, no one really told me about grief. I had lost relatives and friends in high school, and really from observation, I just learned to be sad at first, and that was okay, but after some undetermined amount of time, it was just known that you stop talking about it and that you just keep it private as if it were something that's not acceptable or to be ashamed of. As I went through those losses, I had well-intentioned people trying to comfort me. And maybe you've had this experience too, where you have a pet maybe that you lost as a kid and your parents went out and replaced it quickly without really talking to you about it. Maybe you had a heartbreak and that's something that your friends tried to encourage you with, to say, it's going to be okay. You'll find someone else, someone better. Well, what they're basically saying is that it's not okay to be in pain right now. And they're trying to force you into the future. But the future isn't here yet. And we need to sit with the pain in the present, because that's where the healing happens. We can only experience life in the here and the now, on the inhale and the exhale, each moment that we have together. If we try to live in the past, it can lead to depression. And if we try to live in the future, it can lead to anxiety. Life and love happen in the present moment. And grief and healing happen in the present too. After the memorial, we returned home to an empty kids' room. I could barely stand it, but I really wasn't ready to change it either. As I would look around the room, I would see her photos framed around on the shelves. And they were such a stark reminder of the permanence of her loss. that my heart would sear all over again and I would just have to turn them down. But as the weeks went on, I just missed her, and I wanted to see her sweet smile again. And so one by one, I started turning the photos back up. And on hard days, I would ugly cry with them. Like the kind of ugly cry you don't do in front of other humans. Like snot pouring out of your face, sounds that even scare your own self. And that was just such a freedom to have, to sit with those photos and let that out. On the good days, I could look at them and smile at them and see her smiling back at me and tell her how much I missed her. On the lonely days, they gave me a way to hold her when she wasn't here to hold. Over time, I realized that these photos were the greatest tool I had in my grief. They gave me a space to feel the fullness of whatever I was feeling without fear. I didn't have to worry about judgment from anyone else or expectations. It was amazing. And I wanted to give that gift to others. In that time of grieving, I was able to transition from focusing inward and being in survival mode to starting to look outward again. And so I keep my ears open. And anytime I heard of anyone facing a terminal diagnosis, I would volunteer a portrait session. I knew how special those photos were. And the cool thing is, people took me up on it. So I showed up for this family, and the impact was incredible. This little girl was able to introduce her new friends to her daddy through this book after he died of cancer. A mom was validated on Mother's Day, weeks after she had lost her first baby. I wish I could tell you all the stories, but for the sake of time, I'll just let you know that every single story had a profound impact on me and inspired me to keep showing up even when times got hard. This led me to create Love Not Lost, a nonprofit organization focused on supporting people in grief with love and empathy. As we showed up to serve families facing a terminal diagnosis, we were listening to their stories, to their struggles, and we learned that there's this trend of people not showing up, people who they thought they could count on for support, friends and family, just disappearing. We would hear that they were afraid to lose their jobs because of their underperformance in grief, or even losing their job because of missing too much work caring for a loved one on hospice. As Love Not Lost grew, I was invited to speak to more places. And in that, I met so many incredible people. And I would hear that, afterwards, people would line up afterwards to talk to me, and they would tell me how much they appreciated my talk and how they didn't know how to support their loved ones or their friends or coworkers. And so I started realizing, that's a big gap, okay? Then I would have executive leaders come up to me and tell me how they weren't sure how they were going to support people on their teams going through grief, and they needed help. So without, it's like there's so much of the unknown and misconceptions. If that's you and you're feeling like, yeah, I don't know what to do with either, or I don't know what to do with grief either, and I want to show up for someone, please know you're not alone. There are so many misconceptions that can make grief even worse. People having unhealthy expectations, or grieving people feeling like they're doing it wrong. That only adds to the pain. So let me be clear. Grief is not a singular emotion that anyone can just move on or get over. It's complex. We grieve because we love. Grief is just love in another form. It's the yin to the yang of love. We never lose love, and we never lose our grief. It's a state of being. It's a process of healing. And what I learned is this: to heal, we must grieve. To grieve, we must feel. And to feel, we must be present. Even in those hard and uncomfortable moments that are so challenging to sit with. 2010 is the year that death came knocking on my door. It's 2020 now. It is a wild year. We are all experiencing loss and trauma of all kinds. And I want you to know, if you're grieving, you're human and you're not alone. Grief is a natural and normal response to loss of something we loved or valued. There are many types of grief. We are experiencing collective grief as we all go through this together. We have anticipatory grief of the loss yet to come. We have ambiguous grief, where you're losing not the person, but maybe who they were. We're all going through different losses, and we have compounding losses too. Grief that happens with more grief happening behind it before we can even process what's already happening. We have losses that are domino affecting and creating secondary losses. We are all going through this together, and it is so, so hard. The acute grief that we're feeling now and the chronic grief that we'll be feeling for years to come. And it's easy to think of grief in the hard moments, but grief happens in the happy moments too. With a marriage, you lose the sense of independence. With having a baby, you lose a sense of freedom. Those losses often go unacknowledged, but they're important to feel. You may not be able to put into words what you're feeling in your grief. It may feel like you're foggy or cloudy, or you're sick physically, or anxiety or depression. But whatever grief you have in your life, I believe that 2020 is asking you to listen. With each instance of loss and trauma, in the midst of pain, we receive an invitation to heal, to slow down, to be present, to listen and respond with intention. Healing for you won't look the same as healing for me, just as grief doesn't look the same for you as it does for me. We all experience it uniquely. Even myself, the different losses that I've experienced are all unique in their own way. But the good news is that grieving is a skill. It is something you can get better at. It took me a while to realize that my body was designed to heal and that grief was working for me and not against me. As I improved in the areas of mindfulness and meditation and self-care, I got better at healing in grief. Truly listening, because after all, our emotions are the core of being human. Emotions are energy, a frequency. They're energy, motion, in motion. And as we can feel them and let them move through us, we can heal. I think that's a big reason why digging our daughter's grave was so great, because they helped us with that motion, getting those feelings out. There's a narrative in our society, though, that emotions are bad, that if you're a man, feeling too much can make you seem weak or too feminine. And for women, that you can be seen as dramatic or too much. This is a really dangerous and damaging narrative in our society, and it's something that I hope we can change. Our emotions are the language of the body. They help us connect to ourselves and each other. And so our battle is against distractions and staying present. We have so much noise in our lives, the physical noise of traffic and construction, to the digital noise of advertising, consumerism, scrolling on social media, 24-hour news reporting. And then we have the noise inside of our heads. That noise, the lies that we're not good enough, that we should be ashamed of something we've done, or that we're not worthy of love. That is the noise that can cause us to check out, to disconnect from ourselves, to avoid pain. And our society tells us that pain is bad. But what if pain is here to help us heal? I believe that if we can lean into that pain, if we can be present in those hard emotions, we can stay connected to ourselves to heal. We can't focus on other people until we focus on ourselves. I don't know if you've heard of the phrase hurt people, but I believe that to be true. But I also believe that healed people heal people. And so, as we continue to show up for ourselves and face the things that we need to face, we learn how to hold space for ourselves, to love ourselves with unconditioned and acceptance, so that we can show up for others and do the same. I think being present in life is one of our greatest challenges. Pain, loss, and grief can be really hard, but they can be really helpful as a catalyst to change that we wouldn't have otherwise made. I can never go back to the person I was before Skylar, and nor would I want to. Healing is a process of becoming whole, not reverting to who we were. I joke around that my life before Skylar was BS, like BS before Skylar, but also BS, total BS, because I cared so much about image and name brand and awards and what people thought of me so much more than I cared for myself. It was hard, but that grief wrecked me in good ways too. It gave me a fresh perspective, something I'm so grateful to have at such a young age, to realize that love is the most important thing that we have on this earth. It connects us all. It connects us to ourselves and to each other. I believe it brings healing too. And at Love Not Lost, the driving question of our organization is, how can we love people better? Remember how I told you that there were people who were hurting and people who were not showing up for them? Well, we saw a way that we could bridge that gap and help people show up in love. And so we connected them through tools like howcaniloveyoubetter.com. When we heard about the people who at work were feeling concerned that they were losing their job or going to be bullied, we created a grief and empathy support program for executive leadership to bring healing to the workplace. The key in showing up is not to be afraid of your own emotions, whatever they are, and create a safe place for others and not trying to fix or change anything, just letting it be. Our mission is to revolutionize the way we heal in grief, because death doesn't discriminate. It's here for each one of us. We just don't know when that time is. But death isn't the bad guy. Distraction is. Disconnection. Disconnection keeps us from loving, it keeps us from feeling, and it keeps us from healing. Can we learn to be mindful? Can we choose to be people who fight distraction and anxiety and intentionally stay present, even in the hard moments? I believe we can, and I invite you to join me as we become healed people who heal people.